going on, guys? Dan and Nick here from Backwoods Overland, and today we're going to be installing a 4runner roof rack on a 2018 Toyota 4Runner TRD Pro. Now, the steps that we'll be doing today will apply to the 2010 all the way up to the 2019 4Runner models. So before we get started, let's take a look at all the tools we're going to need to get the job done. So in terms of tools, we have a impact gun with a 13mm socket. We also have a 5mm and a 4mm Allen key. After that, we have a 10mm and a 13mm ratchet wrench. We also have a panel remover tool. We have a siding removal tool, which we'll get to a little bit later. And then we're going to use a couple of adjustable crescent wrenches. Now, we also used a nutsert tool. You're more than likely going to need one of those because we do have nutserts that we'll be installing. And then we also have a tube of Permatex that we use to seal up those nutserts that we installed. So the first step in our installation process is to remove the factory roof rack. And in order to do that, we need to make sure that we remove the plastic that is on the front of the rack first. And in order to do that, we're going to take a siding remover tool. This is actually used for residential siding. We're going to pull the plastic parts out towards the middle of the roof. So there's a little slot back here on the middle of the plastic piece. You're going to slide the siding removal tool in that slot, and you're going to pull directly to the other side of the rack. And then once your plastic cover is removed, there's two 13mm bolts that are going to come out. And now we're going to do the same thing on the other side of the vehicle.
Okay, so for the back section of the rack, it's pretty much the same as the front. You just take your siding removal tool, which is what we found to be the best tool for this. Put it in the little groove there in the back. Pull it to the opposite side of the truck. You'll see it unsnaps. Pull it towards you, and it comes right off. Once all four of these bolts are removed, you can then lift the rack off. What you want to do now is you want to start the assembly of the laser cut side rails for the rack. In order to do that, you just take this plate, you're going to put it on the back side. You're going to take each one of the bolts and put it through like that. You want this on the inside of the rails. Each one of the bolts in. You're going to then flip it over. Put each one of your washers on, and then each one of your nuts. Once you have them loosely fitted, you're gonna flip it back over using a wrench and an Allen key and tighten them down.
So now that we have our side rails assembled, we're going to go ahead and mark out the location for the holes that we're going to need to drill for the front of the vehicle. So we do have these 3 spacers that are going to go underneath of these side rails, and they're going to fill out the spaces of the OE roof rack that we took out. So we're going to go ahead and place these in. Then we're going to take our new side rails and we're going to flip these up, and we're actually going to put the bolts for the side rails in place. We're just going to loosely install them. We're not going to tighten anything down yet. We're just trying to get the location for the front 2 holes that we're going to have to drill in the rail so that we know where we need to drill those.
For lining up the front of the rails, like Dan had mentioned, he started the bolts in the rear and then the center of the rack. And what we're going to do is we're going to come up here. Now that those are in place, you kind of put them in the center of those bolts and mark where your front slat is. Once that's marked, you actually pull this up. We'll take tin snips and cut the rubber out. We'll insert our spacer into there, and then we'll eventually drill our holes. The next step, before we drill through the roof, what we're going to do is we're going to remove this little handle. In order to do that, there's a little gap here that you can use like a tiny pry tool or a tiny screwdriver and pull each one of these side pieces off here. Just snap them loose. You'll then pull the handle out, and we're going to take the roof liner. We're actually going to just lightly separate it. You don't want to do it too much because it'll crinkle if you do. You just lightly separate it, and then we're going to put a towel in between where we're going to drill and where the airbag is. You obviously don't want to drill into your side curtain airbags. be very delicate here when you're drilling through. Take your time. You don't want to pop through because you'll go straight into the airbag. You want to gently let the bit go through the metal. Okay, so now that we got our holes drilled, we're just going to use our nutsert tool to insert the nutsert, and we're going to crank down on this. And this, what this does is it'll actually pull the nutsert tight into the steel. So the next thing I did was I cleaned the roof nice and good, and then I took some Permatex and put it around where the bolts will go in. That way it's nice and sealed. Now that I have all the bolts in place, I'm going to go back through and tighten all of them down. After that's complete, we can put the black caps on, and then we'll go to the other side and do the exact same thing.
Alright, so now that we got the rack laid out on the ground, the first step we want to make sure that we do is we have a long rail and a short rail for the sides. We want to make sure that those are opposite. So I want to make my short rail at the front on this side, and my long rail is going to be at the front on the opposite side. Now, when we have everything set up, your edge pieces are both the same, so it doesn't really matter which side those go on, but right now we're going to go ahead and assemble the two rails together before we put the middle cross members in.
What you're going to do is you're going to take your smaller piece, you're going to slide it in here like that. You're going to take each one of your nuts, you're going to insert them into each side. As you gently slide this together, this larger piece goes in here, and then you're going to gently feed each one of those through. And what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to capture this piece here. So you line the holes up there. I don't know if you can see that. Each one of those get lined up, and as soon as you have them lined up, you can push your bolt up, start screwing that in. Once you've started the process there, you can flip it over, and then just take your 5mm hex key, tighten those down. All right, so one of the things you want to remember when you're lining up these slats is that you want to start with your very first hole, and that's going to go in your first slat here. After that, it's going to be every other hole, and you're gonna have 11 of these bolts on each side, one for each one of the 11 slats. The other thing to keep in mind when you put these together, you're going to have one longer length here and then a shorter length, and they're going to be opposites on each side. When you go to assemble, you want to have the nut facing down and these holes where you're going to put the bolt facing up. That'll make everything go together a lot easier. Once you get all your screws inserted, you're just going to lift the rack up and start tightening everything down. Next, you're just going to throw the corner into place, Tap it, make sure it's nice and even there. And your hole lines up good. And you're just gonna take your bolt, insert it in there, tighten her down. So what you're gonna wanna do next, now that you have the rack all put together, you're gonna work on the wind diffusers. And what you're gonna do is you're just gonna take, there's one end of the diffuser has a solid hole, the other one has a open hole. You're gonna assemble each one of these. You're gonna have obviously the bolt, the nut, and then the lock washer. One goes in here. I always put the lock washer on the top. When you go to install these on the rack, you're gonna wanna do this before you put the rack on the vehicle. It makes it a lot simpler. If you forget, no big deal. If the vehicle has a sunroof, you can open the sunroof, access it from underneath in the vehicle sometimes. Depending on which rack you're doing, you might want to test it out a little bit and play with whether you want to install the wind diffuser on the first slat or the second slat back. It makes a difference. We have had better results on some vehicles with it put on the second rack, or the second slat rather, versus the first slat. What you want to do is along the bottom rails here, the laser cut rails, you have little places where the bolts are going to go. You take the bolt, slide it right in the track, like so. You're going to slide it over, lift the rack up, just enough to get the bolt to go into the hole. Once it's in there, you're going to take a flat washer and the nut, the nylock, and you're just gonna screw the nylock right on. Now once we have all the bolts into the track in each spot where it lines up with the laser cut rails, you're going to go back and tighten all those bolts down.
Alright guys, so that's going to do it for the install of the front runner roof rack on the 2018 TRD Pro 4runner. Now if you like what you saw, go ahead and hit that subscribe button down below, hit that like button, leave us a comment, do whatever you want to do. You know, it's 2019, you can do whatever you want nowadays. So we're going to be making a bunch of more content. We got a couple really cool builds coming in and out of the shop, so make sure you stay tuned for what's coming up next. Thanks, see you guys next time.